Chapter 24. In November of 1927, we had another experience with a Japanese freighter. It was one of our most interesting and memorable trips. Memorable in that it may have been the first time that I came to grips with the fact that Papa couldn't do everything, also because it introduced us to a vacation spot that we were to love for years. Papa announced one evening, "I'm going to investigate a shipwreck. A Japanese freighter, the Tenpaizen Maru, has run aground at the mouth of the Copalis River. I'll take you along. It'll be a good education." We left before dawn, and we girls spent the trip snuggled together, speculating about wrecks. We all knew about wrecking havoc. Papa had often accused us of that when we were engaged in what we considered fairly normal activity. We knew about the funny forks that got wrecked in the dishwasher, but by far the best picture we had of a thing wrecked was what Dor had done to my favorite doll. Evidence of the mutilation had been scattered all over the house, an arm here, a foot there, a hank of hair. "A wreck is what you made of Mary Elizabeth Betty Jane Crescent Spice's Littleham," I said to Dor, and fell asleep, dreaming of the wrecked ship. Several hours later we arrived at the Copalis River. A mist of ocean smells hung over us as we left the car beside the rutted road. Screeching gulls swooped overhead. The roar of the waves filled our ears. I can see Papa now, his slicker flapping in the wind, leading his 3 Pacific Coast babies through the driftwood, across rocks, and over small streams which cut sharp channels through the sand. We had a hard time keeping up, but eventually he slowed down, pointing to a great eerie form looming in the foggy distance. It looked like a ghost, but we knew that it must be the ship. I was filled with awe and wonder, but as we came closer, I became perturbed. This was not my idea of a shipwreck. This huge vessel, almost identical to the ones we saw on Lake Washington, was sitting upright in the waters just off the shore. No splintered timbers, no broken beams, and no remains of a fractured skeleton were strewn upon the sand. It had no resemblance whatsoever to the wreck of my doll. Papa answered our objections. "It'll be a skeleton soon enough." "But Papa, if it isn't broken, aren't they going to pull it out?" "It's not possible. But what will happen to it?" Papa shrugged and started back to the car. That evening we gathered around the pot-bellied stove in the small reception room of the inn. The innkeeper's 15-year-old son had been at the scene of the disaster, and he told the story as expertly as if he had recited it a dozen times. "It happened in a 50-mile-an-hour gale. The captain wouldn't leave the ship, thinking maybe they could save it. But there's no saving a ship once these sands grip the hull." Papa agreed. "In the coming years, that old ship will be pounded right down into its grave. It'll end up in China." Everyone agreed with that. The innkeeper's son explained. Tons of stuff floated in on the tide. He went to a sideboard and returned with some of the objects, which included Japanese shoes, pieces of quaintly angled wood with velvet straps. We had never seen such shoes. He took off his heavy boots. "You force the thongs between your 2 biggest toes." He stood up and clattered across the wooden floor, while 3 little Bigham hearts pounded with admiration. At the insistence of his mother, he gave us each a pair, and we clattered along behind him. When Papa finally corralled us, objecting to all the noise, the young man went on with the story. A team from the Coast Guard station rigged a breeches buoy and brought the crew off. Papa explained a breeches buoy to us. Breeches are canvas seats attached to a ring buoy that's suspended from a pulley that runs along a rope. It works like Mama's clothesline. I got the picture. "That's when the shoes fell off the Japanese," I explained to Dor. But I didn't get the picture about the other aspects of the wreck. In spite of all the explanations that night, I couldn't accept the ship's fate. It seemed like such a waste that men could build a great ship, and then, because of one storm or one misdirection, the ship was doomed. I came up with every scheme that a 10-year-old could think of. "Papa, why couldn't they get tugboats to pull it out? Why couldn't they use the big cranes like on the docks?" Papa had an answer for every scheme. After our initial trip, Papa would declare every investigation he had in the Grays Harbor area a holiday. We would spend several days at Copalis. Our excitement would begin when we would leave the town of Hoquiam and head west. Papa, relieved of the pressures of business, was usually in his expansive mood. He would call out the rivers and towns named by the Quinault Indians, who lived on a large reservation 10 miles north of the town of Copalis. "That's the Wishkah River, and that's the hump tulips." We always knew when we were coming within sight of the ocean. Papa would point out that the timber was getting scrubby from being beaten by storms off the ocean, and Mama would say, "I can smell the wonderful salt air." We girls wouldn't dare blink our eyes, for fear that we would miss the chance to call out, "I saw the ocean first." Then, we'd begin to hear the great ocean roar and see the piles of driftwood laying back against the gentle dunes. As the car bounced across the little Copalis River Bridge, we knew that, around the next corner, we would see a little cluster of gray and weathered buildings. The gas station, the store, the small cafe, several sheds and shacks whose identities were difficult to determine, and finally the small inn that stood at the entrance to the campground. During our first years at Copalis, we pitched our tent amongst the scrubby trees of the campground. Later, we stayed in one of the small single-construction cabins, which had been built among the sand dunes. The innkeepers, Mr. and Mrs. Meneth, were robust, happy-spirited, and spoke in heavy German accents. Papa adored them, and always brought them Limburger cheese and other delicacies. They enjoyed having us come, and always found a place for us to stay. Mrs. Meneth tended the desk, while her husband Fritz was out and about the campground and cabins. Fair-haired, sun-bronzed Freddie, their only child, did chores. When Mrs. Meneth needed Fritz to show a cabin or deliver wood, she would call out in a high, lyrical voice that could be heard even above the screeching gulls, "Fritz!" If Fritz didn't come running, and he often didn't because he loved to visit, she simply repeated herself until he did. High tide at Copalis was up almost to the driftwood, but low tide looked like the water had run off the other side of the earth, leaving miles of sandy beach over which one had to walk if one wanted to dig clams. If one didn't want to dig clams, which was true in my case, one had to walk over the miles of sand anyway, because one was under orders of the big general who said, "By God, my kids are going to learn how to dig clams." Low tide at Copalis Beach always came at 4 o'clock on a chilly, damp, misty morning. "Come on, it's only a few more blocks," the general commanded. We barefooted little soldiers followed reluctantly, carrying sacks, pails, shovels, and whatever. "We" here refers to Fleur and me. Puny little Dor got to stay back at headquarters with the assistant general, warm and snug in bed. Papa showed us the small holes in the sand, under which the clams were supposedly hiding. He told us that, once the clams suspected that we were after them, they were on their way to China. If we didn't want the Chinese eating our clams, we'd jolly well better be fast. Clam digging was a two-part job. First, the general would furiously dig a big hole, while Fleur and I, sleeves rolled up and kneeling at attention, waited for the word go. At the word, we would dive in with all fours, often going down as far as our shoulders. This furious effect continued until the tide started coming in, getting us even wetter than we already were. We would arrive back at headquarters just in time to watch Mama and Dor wipe the sleep from their eyes. "How many clams did you get?" The clams were difficult to count because Papa had mangled them so badly with the shovel, but we held up our few unrecognizable corpses. "All the rest are in China, being eaten with chopsticks," Fleur said. The general tried to remain positive in spite of his aching back. "There's enough for chowder," Mama said. "It's a good thing I brought plenty of celery, onions, and potatoes." We had assumed that everyone had the same problems with digging clams as we did. Big effort, small rewards. That is, until one evening. We were staying in the campground and eating our potato, celery, onion, bacon, and clam soup, ingredients listed in order of greatest volume, when Freddie Meneth and a friend came up to our camp table. "Did you get some clams?" I could see that Papa felt he had better things to do than kibitz with a couple of young whippersnappers, but he was determined to have patience, and he had already lost quite a bit of it. Dorothy had been complaining that Mama had put too much pepper in the chowder. "It's making my teeth grit." Fleur said, "That isn't pepper, dummy. That's sand." Mama explained, "It's hard getting the sand out of the unrecognizable corpses." Papa assumed the all-knowing adult male stance and turned to the boys, explaining the difficulty of getting clams that morning, what with the tides. Mama scraped the rest of the soup out of the pot and put it in Dor's bowl. Dor whined, "I don't like scorched soup." "Eat your soup," Papa said, and turned back to the boys. "And the seagulls." "Bring me all the bowls so I can wash them," Mama said. "Mind your mother," Papa said, and turned back to the boys. "And the weather. Now hang up the dish towels to dry, and all of you get into the tent and put on your pajamas," Mama said. As I was heading through the tent flap, I could hear that Papa was down to the etceteras. "Etc., etc., etc.," Papa said. Finally, the boys got in a few words, which made me glad that Papa hadn't offered to take them out and teach them the fine art of clam digging. "Do you want to buy some clams?" they asked. "Oh, did you get some clams?" Papa asked. Sure, we got our limit, Freddie said. Young whippersnappers, Papa said, and bought the clams. As we were settling down to sleep, Papa remarked, I wonder how they do it. Mama yawned. Why don't you ask them? Papa snorted. What could young whippersnappers teach him? Papa didn't know it then, but there were other things Freddie could teach him. And us girls, too. Freddie was so unlike the boys of our neighborhood. No throwing us on the ground. No threats of monsters. We girls found it difficult to understand Mrs. Meneth because of her accent, but we enjoyed following her about, assisting her in little chores around the campground, or gathering eggs from her chicken house. One day, she told Dor and me about the accomplishments of her pet chicken. Yeah, mine Wooly can sink. I was embarrassed that I couldn't get the picture. To me, the word sink meant being in water and going to the bottom. I wondered if she gave Wooly baths in the bathtub, or could it be possible that she took her chicken to the ocean and let him ride the waves until he got plum-tuckered out and sank. Does Wooly sink very often? Dor asked. Oh yeah, mine Wooly sinks every day. We were hoping for a demonstration, but, as usual, Mrs. Meneth was called to the desk. We were left to ponder. One thing was obvious. No matter what, Mrs. Meneth had always managed to rescue Wooly. But why is sweet Mrs. Meneth so happy about the whole thing? I said. Maybe there's something about chickens that we don't know, Dor said. One thing we did know, however, was that Papa was worried about sinking too. On every visit to Copalis, Papa warned us about the dangers of the ocean. He told us about uninformed people, Midwesterners mostly, who were swept out to sea and eaten by sharks. I came to believe that more Midwestern folk were eaten by sharks in the Pacific Ocean than died at home making cheese. Papa was so fearful of us sinking that he tied ropes around our waists when we went into the water. It was a big embarrassment, especially as we got older. Even the remarks of other swimmers couldn't deter him. One young smart aleck kid suggested, You tie the rope on 'em so when they drown, you can pull 'em back in, huh? Papa predicted, Someday that darn kid'll get his comeuppance. Whether he ever got his comeuppance or not, we never knew, but the last time we saw him, he was dashing into the water on the outgoing tide, having a merry old time while we were still tied to the ropes. On one visit, Dor had a story to tell Mrs. Meneth regarding sinking. My duck sinks too, Mrs. Meneth was excited. So you are ducks havink? Yeah, we are 3 ducks havink. It was hard not to fall into Mrs. Meneth's speech patterns. Papa bought us ducks because he didn't want us a dog havink. Floor's duck's name is Fuzzy, and my duck's name is Muzzy. Fran's duck doesn't have a name because Fran doesn't like ducks. I do too like ducks, dummy, I protested. Then why didn't you give your duck a name, dummy? It was hard to explain that after Floor took the name Fuzzy and Dor took the name Muzzy, I figured that all the good names were taken, so I just gave up. Dorothy continued. When they were brand new, I put them in the wash tub, and they sank. I interceded. Yeah, that's 'cause you went away and left them. If Mama hadn't come along, they would have drowned. Yeah, new ducks is not so gut swimming, Mrs. Meneth said. We already knew that. Und where you are der ducks keeping? We in a pen in the backyard are ducks keeping are, I said. Yeah, we are them in the pen keeping because they on the back steps pooping are, Dor said. Dorothy, you're not supposed to sayink the word pooping. Dorothy, as usual, paid me no mind. And now they in their pen pooping are. Mrs. Meneth wasn't a bit shocked. Ja, I am knowing wat der pooping ist. On every visit, Mrs. Meneth inquired about our ducks. Are you eggs from your ducks getting? She asked one time. No, we were not eggs getting. Are your ducks curly tails having? Ja, Mrs. Meneth explained. Curly tails is not for eggs laying. I didn't understand, but apparently Dor did, because when we got home she cut off our ducks' tails. Then, we waited expectantly for eggs. When it appeared we were doomed for failure, Papa said, Don't feel bad, duck eggs are not very good to eat anyway. Dor was incensed. We don't want to eat the eggs, Papa. We want more ducks. I really didn't want more ducks. I didn't enjoy cleaning up the pooping. Mrs. Meneth had said she would lovink to see our ducks. However, I didn't detect any great joy when, on our next trip, we drove up to the inn with an orange crate tied to the rear bumper. Mrs. Meneth recognized the quacking noises. You didn't your ducks brinkink, yeah? Papa said. We did our ducks brinkink, yeah? The reason we had our ducks brinkink was that we always had the problem of who would take care of the ducks when we were on trips. Our close neighbors had already become alienated over the ducks, so it was no use to ask them. And our distant neighbors have heard stories from our close neighbors, Papa said. Mrs. Meneth assigned us to the cabin furthest away from the inn. The ducks loved the beach and seemed to sense that the lovely open expanse of ocean was more their natural environment than a backyard pen. They became stubbornly independent. One day, a flock of seagulls swooped down into their midst. The ducks honked wildly, darted about, and flapped their wings. I felt the ducks were done for, poor things. Not Dor. She jumped boldly into the center of the great flapping wings, and one by one rescued Fuzzy, Muzzy, and, I just thought of a name for my duck, Wuzzy. Every time we went to the beach, Mrs. Meneth told of Woolly's activities. We were amazed at his longevity. What with all the sinking he was going through? Then one day, much to our surprise, the sinking chicken mystery was solved. We were gather eggs when Mrs. Meneth called for Woolly to come out of her nest. Woolly, scrawny and poor-looking but with a spark in her eye, obligingly came out. Mrs. Meneth gave the command, "Sink, Woolly, sink!" I fully expected that we would be heading for the ocean waves or the bathtub, but before I could even turn in that direction, guess what that little chicken did? It sang a little song, quite unlike the cackling of the rest of the flock. Mrs. Meneth sank right along with her. We were enchanted. Before we knew it, we were sinking along too. Flora and I eventually found something much more exciting than discussing chickens. Freddie had received a promotion. It was now his job to drive the old truck around the campground and collect garbage, and he asked Flora and me to ride with him. Papa wasn't keen on these outings. He said that Freddie was too young to be driving and didn't have a license or insurance. He consoled himself, "Well, the garbage truck may not be around very long. From the sound of it, it's ready to explode any minute." Mama thought that we should be embarrassed. Why would you want to ride around in an old garbage truck anyway? That made us wonder about Mama's eyesight. Hadn't she taken a good look at fair-haired, deeply tanned, aesthetic-looking Freddie? We didn't bother to explain. We just coined the phrase to which millions of mountain climbers have since laid claim, because it's there. On every trip, Freddie drove us out to see the shipwrecked freighter. I always asked the same questions that I had asked Papa, and Freddie always had the same answers. Before the garbage truck exploded, if it ever did, Freddie did another amazing thing. He invited me to go clam digging. In that moment, I forgot all the pain of other clam digging expeditions. I forgot my resolution that the first thing I would do when I came of age was refuse to ever dig another clam. I was so ecstatic by the prospect that I didn't mind getting up at 4 o'clock on a chilly, damp, misty, foggy, no one is out but the crazies morning. I was barefooted, bare-armed, loaded with pails, sacks, and shovels, and shivering. There was no Freddie. At 5 o'clock, there was still no Freddie. Finally, at 6 o'clock, when I was ready to go back to bed and cry my eyes out from a broken heart, I heard the roar of the garbage truck. It screeched to a halt in front of our door. "Right on the dot," Freddie called out as I appeared. "Where's your shoes?" Digging clams with Freddie was an opportunity to observe that rewards are not necessarily commensurate with the effort put forth. Freddie drove to within a block of the dig site. He had on warm rubber boots. At the water's edge, he stamped heavily. "Makes the clams spout," he explained. "But you don't want them to know you're after them, or they'll head for China," I quoted Papa. Freddie had a plausible answer. "These are the clams that already went to China, but the Chinese couldn't catch 'em, so they came back here." When we spotted a clam hole, I hurriedly got down on my knees and prepared to dive in, but Freddie waved me away. He placed the long, narrow shovel with precision on the ocean side of the hole and drove it down. "Don't pull back on the handle. It breaks their shells." He jimmied the handle easily until the sand began to crack. Then he removed only a small scoop, put his hand down, and pulled out a big, lovely, unscathed clam. I was dumbfounded. After that, it was routine. 1 scoop of sand, 1 clam, 1 scoop of sand, 1 clam. We were filling the bag at the rate of about 1 a minute. In a short time, he said, "Well, we got our limit. Now you can go back to bed." Back at the cabin, Papa was blowing on the fire. Mama was filling the coffee maker. They spotted the bulging sack. Papa looked at Mama. Mama looked back at Papa and said, "I don't know. Why don't you ask her?" Through the years, we clattered around in our Japanese shoes until poor, distraught Mama came up with the idea that we shouldn't wear them out. Keep them as a reminder of the occasion. I didn't need a reminder. I thought about the shipwreck often. Then one day, we girls heard a knock on the door and went to answer. "Good afternoon, won't you please?" Standing on the porch was the tall, handsome, blonde, sun-tanned Freddie Meneth. Papa called out for him to come in, and without taking time to discuss politics, he said, "What brings you to town?" I'm attending the University of Washington, studying oceanography. What is oceanography? We asked. It's the study and exploration of the oceans and their phenomena. And how is the Tenpaisan Maru? Papa asked. Freddie, acting like a learned scholar, said, The Tenpaisan Maru is on its way to China. Mama said, I wish I could say the same thing about these Japanese shoes.